All right, for this exam essay, we're going to look at the charges of cells in the body and how different concentrations can affect the charges inside and outside of the cell, and how that affects the movement of ions and can drive different processes in the body. So, to begin, I'd like to look at something that we call the resting membrane potential. So if we take a cell, if we look at a cell in the body, and let's look, for example, at potassium, we know that there's a higher concentration of potassium inside the cell than there is outside of the cell. I'm going to write that as indicated by making the potassium symbols different sizes. And then we also know, for example, that we have sodium at a lower concentration inside the cell than outside the cell, and so on. We also know that where we have positive charges, we also have negative charges. So although I just drew potassium inside and outside the cell, we know that they are paired. And really we have, for example, potassium chloride, and the chlorine has a negative charge. So that means anytime a potassium were to leave the cell, if potassium left on its own, we still have chloride in the cell with a negative charge. So I'm just going to erase that. Something that's important to understanding resting membrane potential is to understand that we have channels in the membrane that will allow the movement of ions, and we have gradients, right? We have different gradients that are acting on these cells. So for example, higher concentration in the cell than outside of the cell, that means to reach equilibrium, those potassiums want to leave the cell, and that is our concentration gradient. But as those potassiums leave the cell, we have, like, let's say we have a potassium that's leaving the cell and leaves through this potassium leak channel that are always open, and we have a positive charge now outside of the cell. But like we said earlier, that potassium ion has left behind a chloride ion in the cell. So that potassium moving out means that this cell has just lost a positive charge, making the inside of the cell more negative than it was before. And because opposites attract, this positive is going to line up along the membrane here, and it's going to be pulled toward this negative, and the negative towards the positive. And this will continue to happen where we have these charges that line up along the membrane of the cell. What this has caused for potassium is an electrical gradient, because these potassiums want to move, are being pulled back toward the cell this way due to those negative charges. So this would be like concentration gradient, and this would be electrical gradient. Now, the degree to which potassium wants to leave the cell, for example, or re-enter the cell because of the electrical gradient, is what we call the driving force, which is essentially just the difference in the membrane potential at equilibrium, and the actual, or the equilibrium potential and the actual membrane potential. And so, in other words, it's just the degree to which a ion wants to move in one direction or the other, inside or outside of the cell. Now, something to note here as well is that because we have potassium leak channels that are always open, potassium is able to leave more easily than sodium is able to enter, because there are no leak channels that are letting potassium or letting sodium in. There are other channels that we'll get into in just a little bit when we talk about action potentials. Now, what's interesting about these two gradients, if you just think for a moment, when you have a cell, you would think that at equilibrium, the potassium inside the cell would match that outside of the cell, right? However, because there's two different forces at play here, the cell can reach an equilibrium without actually having the same concentrations inside and outside of the cell. But if it were this equilibrium of potassium inside and outside the cell being the same, would be calculated by what we call the Nernst equation. Which is equilibrium equals 61.5 over Z log in the concentration inside of the outside, the concentration outside. Sorry, the concentration of the ion inside of the cell and the concentration of the ion outside of the cell. And Z would be the charge of the ion. And this Nernst equation assumes complete permeability of the cell membrane for the ions. So it assumes that, for example, that potassium is completely permeable to the cell membrane. However, we know that's not always the case. And so, we can have an equilibrium without actually having the same concentrations of a given ion on either side of the cell membrane, because of our electrical gradients that are at play here. Now, hopefully I didn't over-explain that. I know I was a little bit all over the place with that one, but we're going to look at how we establish a resting membrane potential. And I'm going to draw a little graph here to help us visualize this. So as we have potassium leaving the cell through leak channels due to a concentration gradient, its driving force is pushing it out of the cell. Our electrical gradient is pulling it back into the cell, because we have the cell becoming more negative as more positive charges are leaving. And so if we see more of these negative charges inside the cell and less positive outside, if we make a little graph here where that's 0, I'm going to put this at about plus 30. And these are millivolts here. This is going to be negative 70. The inside of the cell is more polar with these increased negative charges, and so it has reached a sort of equilibrium where the cell is more negative, at a more negative level. And so that's right here. That's our resting memory potential. So we don't really have much movement of ions inside and out of the cell with that resting membrane potential. Now, when we have a stimulus that increases or decreases the amounts of ions outside of the cell, that can affect this membrane potential and cause the cell to be either more or less polar. So let me come down here a little bit and try to visualize that. So we have, I'm trying to think how the best way to explain this. At different phases of this process and these movements of ions inside and out of the cell, we have different channels, membrane channels that are involved in the movement of ions inside and outside of the cell. And so here, I'm just going to label this as number 1, this resting membrane potential. The only channel we really have that's significant here at play is potassium leak channels. This is why potassium is able to be leaving the cell at a greater rate than sodium would be entering, because those channels are open and sodium is being driven out of the cell. Now, if we were to have some sort of ions that triggered the opening of ligand-gated channels, we would still have potassium channels at play here with potassium leaving the cell. But we would also have ligand-gated channels to take into account. And as more ligand-gated channels open, that could cause depolarization of the cell, where we have the cell becoming less negative because of positive ions moving into the cell. And that would cause this charge of the cell membrane to begin to increase. And that's what we call graded potential. This cell depolarizing is moving towards what we would call a threshold. And maybe I'll make this a different color. The threshold is the point at which sodium gated channels will open, allowing much more sodium into the cell. But sometimes there's not enough stimulus to bring this cell to that point of the threshold, and so it may just kind of come up here and then slowly end up coming back down to the resting membrane potential. And that will not cause what we would call an action potential, because in order for that action potential to happen, we would need for that charge to increase up to threshold or beyond. And I forgot to label this as 2. That's our phase 2. Now, just a little side note, since we're on the topic of threshold, let me make a note over here. The threshold is determined, like where that line falls is going to be determined by concentration of calcium outside of the cell. And that's because calcium is involved in opening and closing sodium gated channels. The more calcium we have, the harder it is for the channel to open. The less calcium we have, the easier it is for those sodium channels to open. And so if we had a high concentration of calcium, it's harder to open, which means we need more of a change in the membrane potential. And so that could bring the threshold up here, for example. It has further distance it needs to go to reach threshold. But if we had less calcium outside the cell, that would make it easier, and that could bring the threshold lower here. So I'm going to go ahead and erase those. Just wanted to mention that. But let's just say the threshold's here at -55 for a neuron. So as you have a stimulus outside the cell, different concentration of different ions that maybe are making the cell more less negative, eventually that can reach a point to which it crosses this threshold. And when that happens, you have, let me see, I'm going to put it just right over here. You have these sodium gated channels with this little springy thingy that's affected by calcium that will open for a very short time, and then this protein here will come back and plug it closed. But in that very short amount of time, you have a lot of, let me put this as red, you have a lot of sodium ions that flood into the cell. And what would that mean? What effect would that have on the cell's charge? Well, it would become depolarized, be less and less negative to a point. And at this point here is where our sodium gated channels are going to close now. So they're going to, this protein here is going to come in here. It's going to close that. And now you have no more sodium flooding in to the cell. And I'm going to label this here as, let me label this here as 3 at this point. So sodium gated channels are now involved at that point. They're open. You also have potassium leak channels at work here. Now at this point up here, the depolarization of the cell has now caused for potassium gated channels to open. So I'm going to label this as 4. So now we have our potassium. Oh, these are voltage gated channels, by the way. I'll put that here. Voltage gated channel. Those are going to open along with, we still have our potassium leak channels open. So this is going to cause the charge of the cell's membrane to rapidly decrease, because again, you have these positive ions that are now leaving the cell at a quick rate, and you don't have sodium coming in as a positive ion anymore. So that's going to cause the cell to become more polar. It's going to what we call repolarize as it goes back down towards the resting membrane potential. But because we have so much potassium leaving through these channels, and the sodium voltage gated channels take a little bit longer to close, that's going to actually cause this to hyperpolarize, meaning it's going to go even more negative below the resting membrane potential towards the Nernst equation value. Again, thinking if a membrane were 100% permeable, trying to reach equilibrium. So it's going to drop down here, and then it's going to be even more negative than the resting membrane potential. Now, and with the potassium voltage gated channels now closed, but potassium leak channels still open, and that is going to bring our our membrane potential back to resting membrane potential. And so with our potassium voltage gated channels closed, but potassium leaks channel still open, that will bring our membrane potential back to resting membrane potential, because you don't have as many potassiums, positive potassiums leaving. So, let's see. This is what we would call an action potential, such as what would happen in a neuron. And you can have different concentrations, like I mentioned earlier, of different ions outside the cell that would cause maybe the resting membrane potential to either decrease or increase, the threshold to decrease or increase, and maybe even cause sodium to come into the cell at a greater rate or slower rate, and potassium to leave the cell at a greater or slower rate, depending, for example, hypokalemia, hyperkalemia, hyponatremia, and so on. And as you can see, this graph differs from that of a graded potential, because really the difference between a graded and action potential is that the graded action potential has a stimulus strong enough to cross threshold, whereas graded potential does not. And it will not have this sort of response, but it will stay below threshold. I almost like to think of it as, let me see if I can draw something like water. If you had water, a body of water, you drop in a small rock into the water. When it goes into the water, it's going to make this splash, and the splash isn't very big. And so if you're trying to hit a tree branch that's up here, without a strong enough or a big enough rock to make a bigger splash, it just can't reach it. It's pretty wimpy, right? It's going to come back to this water surface. But if you were to throw in like a huge rock, right, a giant boulder into the water, it's going to make a bigger splash, and it's going to be able to hit that branch easier because you have a bigger rock, or in other words, a stronger stimulus. And then that will cause the rest of what we see here in this action potential. So I'm just going to erase this really quickly. And let's see here. Okay, something else I want to mention here is that there's something referred to as absolute and relative refractory periods, which I think would be somewhere about right here. So here, we have our absolute refractory period within these dotted lines. This is the period at which the neuron cannot experience another action potential within this time frame, right? Because down here on this axis, this is a function of time. So from here to here, in between these dotted lines, is our absolute refractory period. And the reason it can't experience another action potential is because during this time, I guess this is a better way to explain it. This opening and closing of this gate here in the sodium voltage gated channel is happening extremely fast. And so it'll open very quickly, sodium will flood in, and then this protein will plug it very quickly. And during that time, you can't have a section action potential occur because the gate's already fully open, and it needs time to reset so it can open again. Whereas in your relative refractory period in between these dotted lines, this is where sodium voltage gated channels have reset, but the potassium voltage gated channels are still open. And so because you have that potassium that's leaving the cell, it would take a stronger stimulus to cause an action potential to happen in between this period. But once you get after this relative refractory period, the cycle is reset and the neuron is ready to experience another another action potential. And this is just important because this is what helps the cell, the neuron to fire correctly for the charge or signal to move down the axon in one direction and to prevent it from firing too quickly. Okay, there are two other topics I want to talk about. One is going to be capacitance. The other is length constant, but let me think for a second. Let me talk about length constant first. Length constant, what's the name of this? Which is symbolized by or denoted by lambda. That's what it is, Greek letter lambda. The equation for length constant is square root of membrane resistance over internal resistance. So Rm equals membrane resistance, which is essentially relating to the permeability of the cell membrane, and Ri is the internal resistance. Inside the cell. So resistance meaning the inhibition of an electrical signal moving through the neuron down the axon. So when we think about length constant, essentially what that is how far an electrical signal will move down a neuron's axon before it loses strength to a certain point. So if we have our neuron here like this, we have this axon moving down this way. Our membrane resistance is essentially, if you have a high membrane resistance, it is more difficult for ions to pass through the membrane here. If you have a higher internal resistance, that is going to make it more difficult for, actually, let me explain it this way. Let's back up a second. Okay. So, you've got these sodium voltage gated channels, right? And other channels that are letting ions to pass through the membrane. When you have a positively charged, for example, an sodium ion that's passing through the membrane, coming into the cell, that has and a force field, electromagnetic force field, that is going to send the signal that's going to travel down the axon towards the synapse. And this signal is kind of like, again with the water analogy, right? Drop a rock in the water, it's going to leave these rings going out, these ripples, right? Which are strongest towards the center. And of course, they'll weaken as they travel outward. But if you have anything in the water, like a tree, for example, that is blocking the water from traveling further, it's going to weaken the ripples. So these ripples might continue out this way, but it's going to be harder for these ripples to travel further because they're going to be weakened sooner. This example right here, this tree right here sticking out of the water, is an example of internal resistance. In the cell, these are negatively charged proteins or other physical things that are in the way of the signal. So as this signal is traveling down the axon and it meets those proteins or other obstructions in the cell, it's going to decrease the power of this signal. That is internal resistance. So, a combination of membrane resistance and internal resistance will help us determine how far this signal is going to travel down the axon. Why is that important? Because those signals help to activate and trigger the opening of sodium gated channels down the axon, which will trigger another action potential, so that will move this signal down the neuron towards the synapse. So to recap, length constant, a larger length constant means that the signal is going to travel stronger further. A smaller length constant means that it's going to be weaker. The signal is going to be weakened sooner. Now I also want to mention the concept of capacitance. I don't know if I spelled that right. Hopefully I did. So if we take a close-up of a neuron here, if you have, just going to draw some channels here in this neuron. Let's say you have some sodium coming in the cell, positive charges. What are potassium? Also positive charges. Positive and positive is going to repel each other, not attract each other. If it attracted each other, it would be a positive and a negative. But because they're the same charges, they're going to repel each other. Potassium starts leaving the cell, leaving behind negative charges, right? So as this one comes out here, left behind its buddy right here, it's negative charge. But because you also have this force of this positive being attracted to this negative, and other sodium potentially out here repelling this charge, this this positive charge is going to be drawn down here along the membrane to its partner. And because the power of the force field of this electromagnetic force field of this charge is being shared with this electron, it has less power to repel another positive charge, which could put the positive charge back here in the cell. Because it has less power, more of these positive charges are going to come and join the party here along the membrane. And another way to put this is that capacitance is the number of separations of charges per volt in a cell. And so if you have high capacitance, you're able to separate more of these charges. For example, again, potassium chloride being separated to potassium and chloride. You're able to make more of those separations per volt with a higher capacitance, which would look something like this. Now, there's myelin that will cover portions of the neuron, which I'm going to draw like this. And this myelin is going to affect capacitance and also, therefore, length constant, because myelin actually decreases membrane resistance. Why is that? Think about it. If you have this space that is, or this myelin protein that's covering this kind of cell membrane, you don't have these channels, right, to like let ions in through here. So there's less permeability to ions to pass through here than there would be through the membrane here, for example. And so myelin's going to decrease membrane resistance. Let me do it like this, myelin. And it's also going to increase, sorry, no, that's incorrect. Let's back up. It's going to increase membrane resistance because it's harder for ions to travel through the cell membrane. So myelin increases membrane resistance, and it's also going to decrease capacitance. So why is that? Well, if you have, your potassiums that are coming out here out of this channel, the voltage across the membrane is the same, but here you're going to have less separations than you would in these unmyelinated sections. So where it's myelinated, less separations. So why is that? Well, as these potassiums are pushed out of the cell, for example, there is a greater distance between these separated charges, which means that their energy is not being shared as tightly and closely as these are. And so, because of that, they have more power and energy and ability to repel other positive ions, which could push them back into the cell. And that means we have less separations per voltage in these areas. So myelin will decrease capacitance. Now, let's see. Myelin's also going to, decrease internal resistance, partially because of these negative charges. There's less of them in the way of this signal that's traveling down the axon. And also, this area where there's myelin is considered to be a little bit wider, from my understanding. The cell is a little bit wider in those regions, and so when you have a wider cell versus a narrower cell, and you were to have the same amount of things in the way, it's more spread out over the bigger one, or the wider one. So it's easier for something to pass through than it would be trying to pass through this more condensed region of a cell. So myelin has that effect of decreasing internal resistance. Whoops, not mean to do that. And together, those things have the effect of increasing the length constant, because in these regions, it's easier for a signal to move farther down the axon, meeting less resistance. And so that means that we're able to get that signal down to the end of the row where it needs to be, towards the synapse. And now you've heard way too much of my voice today. Hope you enjoyed this. Hope I was able to explain things somewhat clearly. Still developing my understanding, but I feel that I've been able to increase my understanding quite a bit of what happens in cells and how electrical signals and just electrical forces in general can have such an impact on cells, especially in neurons, like we're studying here. So thanks so much, and hope you have a fantastic and wonderful day.